So this is a project I've been working on to use Python to analyze poetry in ways that you otherwise couldn't just by using conventional reading techniques. The idea came to me when I was reading Alexander Pope, who's this great early 18th century British poet. The thing about the early 1700s in British literary culture is it was extremely competitive. Poets were constantly railing on each other, just really saying really mean things about each other.
Like rap.
Yeah, not like 90s East Coast, West Coast things in rap. So Pope has one poem where he's railing on these other poets and complaining that their rhymes are too predictable. Namely, wherever you find the cooling western breeze, in the next line, it whispers through the trees. Pope, this is just obnoxious that people are always rhyming breeze and trees. Anyways, well, I read this line and I thought, this is a challenge. Does Pope have a better rhyme for breeze? Luckily, it turns out this is actually pretty trivial to figure out with Python. You just need a couple things. The works of Pope, which is pretty readily available, and a really naive rhyme checker, which I constructed from CMU's pronunciation dictionary, which is built right into NLTK, which is Python's natural language processing library. Wrote sort of this janky script, goes through every line of the collected works, and checks each last line and sees if it rhymes with the nearby lines, last words. And the results were pretty interesting. There were 6 instances where Pope rhymed breeze, and I'll present them to you without comment. Breeze. Yeah, so it turns out he's not that much better than these other proposed poets. He actually does rhyme breeze with Z's in the last one, so kind of a little flat. So I thought this was a pretty fun exercise, and I wanted to know what else can we do with Python poetry. Unfortunately, with this script, there's really not much else. It's extremely naive. It just literally went line through line in this raw text. It didn't distinguish between poems. It didn't even distinguish between the poems and the explanatory text for the poems. So in order to do some more robust analysis of poetry, I realized we needed a better data. In fact, we just needed a data structure for poems. Luckily, poems are already pretty ordered things, objects. They're basically just, at their very core, words arranged in lines. So when I started speccing it out, I realized that poems had to have a sense of what lines they are composed of, and each line needed to have a sense of what other lines it rhymed to, and finally words had to have some sort of notion of how they were pronounced. Nevertheless, there are still a bunch of challenges that I faced with Pope. For one, he mostly writes in these rhyming couplets. Couplets are a form where you have 2 lines that rhyme with each other, but interspersed with that, you have triplets, which are similar to couplets, except there's 3 lines that all rhyme with each other. So that means if they were all couplets, you could just say, okay, every other line rhymes with the next line. But with triplets, this became a little more complicated, and I had to write a rhyme checker. But I had to use a pronunciation dictionary, and one of the problems with that is that it's incomplete. It's pretty good for modern language, but Pope is using all these words that someone in the 1700s uses that we don't use anymore, and the spellings are slightly different too, so you can't expect to find all the words in there. In fact, it's also a little bit inaccurate. Again, it's fine for contemporary spoken English, but in England, there are all sorts of dialects depending upon where you are, and then you roll that back 300 years and it can just be a nightmare. In Pope's time, T was pronounced Tay, so that's not something you expect to find in a pronunciation dictionary. And finally, we have to deal with the problem of slant rhymes, which are rhymes that don't perfectly rhyme with each other, like breath and wealth. They sort of rhyme, but in a poem that you would recognize that as line if you were just reading it. So I read this, so I eventually did get some poems into this form, but I thought for a bigger data set, wouldn't it be nice if a poet just chose one rhyme scheme and stuck with it? And a little selfish, but I thought about it for about 90 seconds. And I can only think of one poet that really did that. I don't know if anyone wants to try to guess if we did that. I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. He wrote in a form called the Shakespearean Sonnets. So luckily it was Shakespeare, and with Shakespeare it became much easier. And once I, wrote a rapper class around the poem, and it's very easy. It's only a few lines of code. Then I thought I could even make this even tighter, and sure enough, that's all you need for Shakespearean sonnet. You see you have the A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, you probably recognize from high school or something. So that was really, really nice. So now that we have things in this nice data format, I just wanted to think about what are some interesting things we can measure about a poet's rhymes. And the thing that Pope brought up was the frequency of a poet's rhymes, that it's always breeze with trees, breeze with trees. So I thought it would be interesting to measure the frequency distribution of rhymes in Shakespeare. So there are two ways of measuring frequency, or two predominant ways, also built right into NLTK. One is a frequency distribution, and one is a conditional frequency distribution. A frequency distribution takes a list of items and returns a dictionary-like object that contains each item mapped to the frequency of how often that item appears in the list. So this is going to be very useful for figuring out what the most common rhymes are. Conditional frequency distributions are a little more complicated, and it's better to explain it through an example. But the problem that will help solve is, given a single word, what is the frequency distribution of the words that rhyme with it? So taking Pope's example from before, if we took a conditional frequency distribution of all the words that rhyme with breeze, it would be very small. It would only contain trees and seas. So let's do this on Shakespeare. You see, with this infrastructure, it's very easy. And what you might find, which is very interesting in the sonnets, the most predominant rhymes are thee and me and thee. Which is actually very interesting for the sonnet form, which is a form very interested in the relationship between the speaker and the subject. And especially in Shakespeare's sonnets, there's always a confusion of identity. Gender is often amorphous, and spends a lot of time trying to distinguish between the self and the other. In fact, in the very rhyme, the words are sort of sonically intractable in that same way. So I thought that was interesting.
Love and prov or live and prove?
Well, that's another interesting thing. What's nice is that I didn't have to use a rhyming dictionary. I just knew from the form. But that's something that the pronunciation dictionary wouldn't catch as a rhyme. Now, say we want to find what are all the words that B rhymes with and all the words that me rhymes with. And again, so this is where we use the conditional frequency distribution. And we find that B actually rhymes with more things than me. Very interestingly, it rhymes with melancholy, posterity, and usury, which just gives a sense of Shakespeare can both be me, thee, and also be and usury. So he's the bard. So some conclusions that I came to after doing some of this work is, first, computers are awesome. But ultimately they're just tools. But they're tools that literary scholars really should use, because you can get some very interesting data points that you can incorporate into your other studies of literature. Secondly, that Pope was a hypocrite. Actually, that's probably a bit naive. I think what Pope was actually getting at is a deeper criterion of what makes a poem great. In fact, it's a criterion that a former professor of mine claimed was the most important quality that a piece of art could have. And it's not truth or beauty, but don't be boring. So thank you very much. I hope you like a good poem. This was not boring.